Well, everybody, it's that time of year again. James Schneer here live on Spreaker Web Radio with a preview of the NBA Conference Finals here on tonight's podcast of Real Steel Sports. Hope everybody's having a good weekend. It's a little bit chilly in this neck of the woods. Again, you figure Pittsburgh in May would be getting 70s and maybe even 80s at some point. Nah, you check my phone right now. 48 degrees right now. And it's supposed to be a frost warning for tonight. But anyways, time to get back to sports. We have the Pacers taking on the Heat in a rematch of last year's conference final for the East. And in the West, we have a rematch of the 2012 Western Final between the Thunder and the Spurs. Last year, the Heat defeated the Pacers in 7 grueling games to advance to the NBA Finals, where they won their second straight title over the San Antonio Spurs. And the San Antonio Spurs last met the Oklahoma City Thunder in the playoffs in 2012. Thunder dropping the first 2 before reeling off 4 straight. Let's start off with the East, because I think that's the more straightforward series for most people. Because let's start by talking about the Pacers. They were the best team in the league for the first 50 games of the year. There's no doubt about it. They were easily the best team in the league. I mean, if you just look at their schedule and who they played, they beat all the tough opponents they went against. And if you look at it, they started off the year, they were 35-9 at one point, and 50 games into the season, they were 39-11. They were clearly one of the better teams in the NBA, and they were playing like the best team in the East for the large portion of the season. Then even Miami, who I think at some point had a little bit of a hot streak, and they were a little more up and down this year than they were in years past. They seem to be more inconsistent. LeBron, I think, has had to do more because Wade's not been as good. Bosh hasn't been as good. They lose Mike Miller in free agency to the Memphis Grizzlies, and the three-point shooting isn't as good. The bench isn't as good, so LeBron's had to do more himself. But if you look at the way these two teams meet up, it's almost a perfect contrast in styles. You've got two teams, for one, that hate each other. Two teams that you've got the Pacers that pride themselves on defense and the Heat that pride themselves on scoring. But if you look at the Pacers, the last half of the year, they were absolutely abysmal after the All-Star break. I believe they were 46-13 at one point, and they were like under 500 to finish the season out. They just got so mentally inconsistent, and I don't know what happened. I have no idea what happened because it was just so sudden. They just started losing games, and they weren't just losing by 2 or 3 points. They were losing by 20 to 30 points. The Wizards, the Rockets, they blew the doors off them. Well, they finally got their act together beating the Wizards in 6 games. After a tougher than it should have been series against Charlotte in the first, not Charlotte, against, I can't remember what team, who they played the first round. Atlanta, my bad. I'm thinking of Miami here. But they're starting to play better. Their defense is starting to play better, and I think emotionally they're back on track. Hibbert's doing better. West and George are scoring a lot more points than they were, and I think right now that defense is just clamping down on people. We saw what it did in a couple games against the Wizards. There was 2 games, I think one the Wizards scored 80, and one the Wizards, I don't even think they topped 60. So if you can play that kind of defense against a team with a pretty dynamic offense, it goes a long way. And then you got the Heat. You know, compared to last year, they're not as good. They're inconsistent. They're not, scoring as dynamically. LeBron's doing a lot more, obviously. But in the playoffs, they haven't really been tested. They've played 9 games, won 8 of them, a sweep against Charlotte, got that one right finally, and they beat the Nets, who had swept the Heat in the regular season. But I figure that if anything, the Heat are less battle tested than the Pacers are. But if you look at the way this team structured the Heat, the one thing that I think they've done a lot better at this year is they seem to be playing with a little more determination in the early round of the playoffs. Like they seem to be getting through their games a lot more easily. Because the games against the Nets, a couple of them were blowouts. A couple of them against Charlotte were blowouts too. They seem to be taking pride in getting through to this portion of the Eastern Conference bracket for the playoffs a lot more easily. Now, Dwayne Wade's knee seems to be holding up a lot better, and Chris Bosh seems to be shooting better than he did in the regular season. But it starts and ends with LeBron. It really does. At this point with the history in the Miami Heat, if LeBron is not getting 30 points, the Heat aren't beating anybody. It really is as simple as that because you can't depend on Wade and Bosh to supply the 30 points sometimes if they have to. You can't. And the bench doesn't do much either. So this really is a basic contrast in styles. For this series, the Pacers have home court, and I think that is a huge plus for them because of how good the Pacers were on home court. But they've been absolutely abysmal in the playoffs on home court. Like a couple of the games against the Wizards and a couple of games against the Hawks, they just look so lethargic at home. Like game 1 against Atlanta, they got blown out. But then again, I can't use it as a reference really because they played so much better. Like you couldn't buy into the Brooklyn Nets taking out the Heat 4-0 in the regular season because it was a while ago. Now we have had time to see how the teams have developed. And the Pacers are playing much better. This is not going to be a sweep or a 5-game series win for the Heat like people were probably predicting 2 or 3 weeks ago, if it got to this point. But that being said, the Heat have played tougher opponents, and they've done better. The Pacers, Atlanta's not as good as Charlotte, and Washington is not as good as Brooklyn, I don't think. So if you factor that in, you have to realize that the Heat have not only played tougher opponents, but they've beaten them more easily. And I think the fact that they're a little more rested, I think the fact that they've, played, they haven't been pushed near as much. It's one thing to get pushed a little to test yourself mentally. It's another thing to literally have to fight tooth and nail just to win games. But the fact that the Pacers are shutting down opponents like the Wizards effectively can only help a little bit against teams like the Heat. I mean, if you look at the NBA standings for the 13 to 14 regular seasons, and you look at points per game, Washington had one of the better offense in the league. They're averaging over 100 points a game. Miami averages a few more points a game than they do. But really, at this point, this series, in my opinion, there's 2 guys that can impact this series. Dwayne Wade for the Heat and Roy Hibbert for the Pacers. Here's why. If Hibbert is getting 20 points, if he's getting his rebounds, if he's keeping LeBron James away from the basket, that really can give the Pacers a hell of a mental edge and a good psychological advantage. If they do that, then that's really going to be tough for LeBron to get as much offense. That means other guys have to step up. And Dwayne Wade's going to have to be one of those guys because he's been injured most of the year. Chris Bosh has not been as effective. And Dwayne Wade, has more or less taken a back seat the last 2-3 years. If the Heat are going to advance to their 4th straight NBA Finals and their 5th since 2006, they are really, really going to have give Dwayne Wade a chance to succeed. Wade has to play well. He has to. He has to play well because he doesn't. LeBron's not going to be able to beat the Pacers by himself. My final prediction for this series is to say that I think the Heat will take it in 6 games, and here's why. I'd love to see Indiana beat them because, for one, being a Spurs fan, obviously it makes life easier should the Spurs get past the Thunder. But that's besides the point. The point that I'm trying to make is this. The Pacers, I think, are a little bit physically fatigued. That's obvious. You go 7 games with Atlanta and then 6 with Washington. Meanwhile, the Heat have gone 9 games to get to this round, when the Pacers had to go 7 in their own opening round. You know what I'm saying? They seem to be more rested. They seem to be more ready to go. They've been tested this year. They're mentally prepared because, heck, they've won 2 titles and been in the finals the last 3 years. They're mentally ready. This is a big step for Frank Vogel's basketball team. It really is a step for the Pacers. If they can slay the dragon that is the Miami Heat and get to the finals, see, I don't think they're going to beat either the Thunder or the Spurs. Even if the Thunder don't have Serge Ibaka, doesn't matter. They're not beating either team. The point is this. If they can beat the Heat, that is such a big confidence booster, and that would really... Like, Frank Vogel's job is clearly on the hot seat, even though he's gotten his team just as far as they got last year. If they beat the Heat, that's to give him a contract extension and secure him for a few years, because he's done what nobody's been able to do since 2010, knock the Heat out of the playoffs. 2009, 2010, I mean. But yeah, I think that even though the Hibbert's playing well and those guys are playing better defense, last year they were playing much better at this point, and the Heat were playing better, obviously better too. But the difference in how well they've been playing is so stark. The Heat are playing a little bit worse than they were last year. The Pacers are playing a lot worse, and I think that's a big difference. Compared to last year, the Heat don't have the perimeter shooting because Mike Miller's not there, and they're not getting it out of their other guys. I think that if you factor all that in, even with the defense of Indiana playing better, I still don't think Indiana has quite enough right now on offense to do it. I still think it's going to be a Heat victory and in 6 games. I think it's going to be tough for Indiana to consistently score, especially if Hibbert is average again. Because he had a couple games in the playoffs this year so far, he had 0 points. 0 points will not get the job done against the Miami Heat. Alright, so that wraps up my Eastern prediction. I'm picking the Heat to beat the Pacers in 6 games. On to the Western Finals. The last time these two teams met in the playoffs was 2012 playoffs. It was the 2012 Western Final. A lot of things in my life obviously have changed since then. Job change, things like that. But these two teams really haven't. The Spurs have gotten a little younger, but the Thunder, if anything, are actually, more experienced. They've been in the finals before. They've had some hiccups along the way. They've had some tough losses and some growing pains. But other than that, it's the same. Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook taking on Tim Duncan and Tony Parker. I think what is going to be the deciding factor in this series, in my opinion, is what Tim Duncan does. And the reason why, actually not Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili. Because Ginobili was almost a non-factor when the two teams met in 2012. And he was injured a lot during the playoffs last year and wasn't as effective either. This year, he's played better. He's back to the Manu Ginobili of old, where he's scoring points, getting assists, playing some good defense, being the big third guy that they need in that lineup. He has to play very well. He's got to be getting his perimeter shots, and he's got to be shooting well. For the Thunder, the guy that has to step up, obviously, the MVP. Kevin Durant, if you want to get to the finals, if you want to have maybe the best chance you're going to get, because, again, like I said, the Heat and the Pacers, I don't think are going to beat either team from the West this year. They're just too inconsistent, and they're not playing as well as they were previously. You want your best chance to win a title. I know one of your main guys, Serge Ibaka's out. You got to step up. You have to literally put the team on your shoulders. LeBron's done it to get the Heat to title games. He's done it, and he did it in Cleveland. Tony Parker and Tim Duncan have had to do that in their careers to win titles. You look at the other guys that have won titles in their career. Michael Jordan, the MVPs. These are the greats, and you want to be considered a great? You have to put the team on your back at some point and carry the load. You can't always count on Russell Westbrook. You can't. Can't do it. Now, for the Spurs, it's this simple. They have to hit the three. They have to shoot the threes. They have to be able to hit three-pointers, because if they don't, that is just so problematic, because you look at this team, the Spurs. First off, I'll get into that in a second, but let's just talk about real quick how they got here. You've got the Thunder, who took on, I can't remember who the Thunder played in the first round of the playoffs. How dumb am I? Oh, yeah, I believe it was... I'm serious, is my memory that bad? Yeah, it was the Memphis Grizzlies. Yeah, it took 7 games and a Zach Randolph punch to take out the Memphis Grizzlies, even though a part of me believes that if Zach Randolph had a chance to play, I think the end result would have been a little bit different. Then in the semifinals, he took on the Clippers and took them out in 6 games. And other than the Game 1 hiccup, they looked very, very impressive. They really did throughout the series, taking 4 of the last 5. Then you have the Spurs. Very tough series with the Dallas Mavericks, who played inspired basketball. But when the Spurs kicked it in and they really showed their true stuff, Mavs had no chance. But then again, you go the next round, and it was a complete and total opposite when they took on the Trailblazers. Trailblazers, I think, were a little bit mentally worn out, from the great regular season they had, and also from the series against the Rockets. But I don't think you can really make excuses for that, because the Spurs, they just kicked it in another gear, and they blew them out in 5 games. So if you look at it right now, the Thunder